Chapter 3 Rosie's. At the back of a dark barn, Jenny curled up between two bales of hay. She pulled bunches of the scratchy grass from each bale and piled it over her. Soon there was enough that it trapped body heat, and her shivering subsided. She guessed it was near midnight when she'd found the barn, and her feet had been protesting more with each step. It would be unwise to run herself into the ground and have no energy to evade capture if caught in a tight spot. She needed sleep. Tomorrow she'd get her bearings and decide on her next move, but for now, sleep. Croak kept watch from a rafter in the barn's roof. His night had been much easier, gliding in the moonlight above his mistress as she ran, walked, and stumbled through fields, bogs, and scrubland. If he'd been able, he'd have told her she needn't worry. Erik's guardsmen were miles behind, trudging through the countryside with no real determination. Their boss was a prick. Underpaid and underappreciated, they viewed the entire mission of capturing his absconded bride as well below their stations. But Croak had no easy means of communicating with Jenny, apart from croaking and pecking her ear, which she seemed to object to these days. So he was glad, in his raven way, that she'd stopped to rest. He'd watch over her and screech to the high heavens if anyone approached. Jenny's dreams alternated between happy memories of her childhood in the nuns' orphanage and nightmarish visions of her wedding night with Erik, or what it might have been. In her dreams his reputation proved true, and he was all over her as soon as they were alone in his chambers. She was his plaything, nothing more. For her, the trappings of royalty would provide no solace against his perverted treatment. He even invited guardsmen to join them. In her last nightmare she ran naked and screaming through the castle halls, with the men in hot pursuit, their armor clanging and erections protruding from chainmail. She woke with a start. Convinced she'd screamed out loud, she held her breath and shrank further back into the hay bales. A full minute passed, and nobody came. The nightmarish visions subsided. Bright shafts of sunlight beamed through the cracks in the barn's walls. Above, Croak croaked a good morning, and Jenny relaxed. She brushed the hay aside and stood, her joints popping and aching, but her mind refreshed. She remembered a nun telling her that dreams, even bad ones, were the mind's way of dealing with the day's events and putting them to rest. Jenny had been on the run for 2 days and nights now. With little progress made by day, worried she'd be sighted, she kept clear of the roads. It was slow going. At night the journey was easier, finding the road again and settling into a steady pace, but always ready to jump into the bushes at the roadside should anything appear. She stole fruit from orchards and drank from puddles. All the while her faithful Croak was never too far above. The goat-herder's Hessian clothes scratched and itched her skin. Jenny longed for refuge, somewhere safe enough that she might wash and change into softer fabrics. After checking that no farm workers were in view, she set out from the barn. She'd always kept the rising sun at her back to ensure a westward route, but today that was no longer necessary. The snow-capped western mountains grew ever larger on the horizon. They beckoned to her, the natural border to the kingdom and her salvation from the evil hands of Prince Erik. "Not long now, Croak," she called to a circling raven. He answered with a croak and flew on ahead. Night came sooner as each day passed. Winter had the land in her grip, and she was flexing her icy muscles. By twilight, Jenny's feet ached again, and she looked for somewhere to rest for a few hours. The soft orange glow of oil lamps in the distance suggested a village, the last before the mountains. She had better stop there and do some serious planning. She was in no fit state to attempt the Devil's Pass, not in these clothes, not without provisions. As with most villages, evening activity centered around the tavern. Even from the streets away, she could hear its occupants shouting and laughing. At one point, someone burst into song. Crouched behind an empty dwelling, Jenny whistled for Croak and tilted her head to allow him space on her shoulder. He flapped his way to her. Okay, Croak, you know what I need. They won't feed me for free in there. Go get shiny things. The raven gave her a peck and lifted off, sharp talons digging through the Hessian fabric and into a skin. Ouch! Bloody raven, why didn't I adopt a dog? But Jenny would never swap him for another pet. She loved him, and it was more correct to say that Croak had adopted her, all those years ago. They came across each other as she picked apples for the nuns. He'd never left her since. Not for any significant length of time. Occasionally he would disappear for a while to collect shiny things. More than once he'd landed Jenny in hot water when items of jewelry or coins turned up on her windowsill. Tonight, that habit would prove useful. The tavern's noise and warmth teased her as she shivered behind the stone wall. She hoped he didn't take too long with his thievery. From above the village, Croak spied a loose attic window. He flapped down and forced his way inside. Only minutes later, he dropped a silver coin into Jenny's hand. Well done, my friend. That should buy me some warm soup at least. The tavern door was heavy. When Jenny pushed her way in, she realized how tired and weak the journey had made her. Heads turned and eyes lingered. She had a newcomer's second thoughts upon entering, but here within, the food smells were richer, and the warmth from the fire enveloped her. She stood her ground, scanning the room for somewhere quiet to hide. The booth at the far end, opposite the hearth, that would do. Right now it housed only a sole occupant, a rather chubby fellow feasting on something hot and tasty. She wandered over and asked, Is this seat taken? Even though it was obvious the bench seat opposite was free. This man didn't look the type to dine with a companion. Leo shrugged, lifting his gaze from his second helping for the night. Jenny sat opposite. The patrons that had been staring at her now shifted their attention back to drunken banter. Although some women stared a few seconds longer, their expressions less than friendly, as if Jenny had jumped a queue or broken an unwritten rule of etiquette. Yvette came to take Jenny's order rather than make her place it at the bar. The stranger lacked confidence. She looked freezing, which wasn't surprising given the dirty rags of clothes she wore, a single layer by the looks. "Soup, please?" Jenny asked as Yvette leaned over. "If this will buy it." She produced the silver coin. "It will buy more than that, love," Yvette answered. "I suggest Rosie's famous stew. There's beef in it tonight, isn't there, Leo?" This elicited a grunt from Leo, but to endorse Yvette's sales pitch, he lifted his spoon, showing off a hunk of glistening meat. "Yes, please," Jenny replied. Yvette returned to the kitchen behind the bar. She ladled steaming stew into a large bowl for the poor lass. Jenny relaxed in the booth, letting the warmth soak into her bones. A little tap on the nearest window signaled that Croak had spotted her and would not be far away. Feeling guilty that he wasn't inside, she reminded herself that birds didn't suffer from the cold, at least not as much as humans. He'd find somewhere warm if needed. Before Yvette returned, the man named Leo leaned closer to the newcomer. The chubbiness of his body extended to his face. Soft jowls framed a snub nose and small eyes. An untidy mop of hair receded from a bald spot. But he had a kind enough expression, even smiling at her. "If you want me to eat your pussy, it will cost you a serving of stew and a large ale. But if I was you, I'd look after your stomach first." He went back to eating, as if what he'd said was the most natural thing in the world. I beg your pardon?" "I said, if you want me to—" But Yvette interrupted, plonking down Jenny's dinner. "Don't mind him, he doesn't realize you're not from around here. Leave her alone, Leo. Not everyone craves your services. Goodness me." Jenny, thinking she'd misheard the man, filled her tummy with delicious vegetables, broth, and generous chunks of meat. Preoccupied as she was with eating, she didn't hear Croak's frantic tapping on the window. A commotion erupted at the front of the tavern. 3 men were trying to barge through the door at once and made a poor show of it. 2 of the men bore Prince Erik's coat of arms, the mongoose, on their tunics. They wielded swords. The third and larger of the trio seemed to have no connection to the soldiers. A bearded brute of a man, he burst between them and staggered into the tavern. "There he is! That fat bastard has been having his way with my missus!" "Shit! Time for me to leave," Leo mumbled and pushed himself off his seat. Peering around Leo, Jenny spotted the soldiers. "Me too," she squeaked in fear. "But how? The door's blocked." Leo didn't answer. Instead, he began a slow amble towards the bar. The brute and the two soldiers parted the crowd and came crashing towards them. Yvette, balancing a tray of drinks in the middle of all the fuss, determined that Leo would never make his escape, not with his ponderous rolling gait. She tripped over the brute's feet, upending the tray against his crotch and falling down for added effect. Bargirl and brute ended up sprawled across the floor, covered in ale and wine and impeding any further progress of the soldiers behind. "You owe me one, Leo," Yvette muttered under her breath as she struggled underneath the cheated husband. "Let us through, you fucking bumpkins!" a soldier shouted as he stepped over the mess. "By orders of the prince! That's his bride back there!" But the two runaways were nowhere to be seen.